Spiritual disciplines. In our human weaknesses, even as Christians, we must discipline ourselves to think clearly and to respond biblically. Here's Gene.
This particular principle comes from that amazing story that we call the Transfiguration. And as you look at what Luke has recorded, he's given us two details that you won't find in the other Gospels, namely in Matthew and Mark, where we have this particular story reiterated. And these two details involve two things. First of all, Jesus, when he went up on the Mount of Transfiguration, and we believe this was probably Mount Hermon. Personally, I believe it was because he was, this is recorded after Jesus was in Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi was way north in Israel, at the foot, really, basically, of Mount Hermon, which is one of the tallest mountains in that area. And that's where Jesus said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And oftentimes that particular area was called the gates of hell because it was so infested with demonology. You look up at the caves, some of us have been there, and you see where they had these idols that they worshiped. But after that event, Jesus went up on the Mount Transfiguration. He took three men, Peter, James, and John. And you'll notice that here in this event, as Luke records it, we read this. About 8 days after this conversation that he had there at Caesarea Philippi, he took along Peter, John, and James and went up on the mountain to pray. Now, there we have reference to the fact that Jesus devoted himself to prayer up on that mountain. Matthew and Mark don't record that particular event, but the Holy Spirit through Luke wants us to know that. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. What a scene that must have been. It's just beyond description. And suddenly, two men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah. Remember one time Jesus was talking with the Sadducees, and they denied the resurrection? They didn't believe in the resurrection. They were very liberal. The Pharisees did believe in a resurrection, but the Sadducees didn't. And God said to these Sadducees that God is the God of the living and not of the dead. And this demonstrates it, because who was with Jesus? Two men that had lived centuries before, who were alive and with Jesus, Moses and Elijah. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. In other words, he's talking with them about his death. And so here we have a focus on the fact that Jesus was praying, but they woke up. And notice this is another variable that we don't have recorded in the other Gospels. It doesn't say that they fell asleep, but they did. And so here's what we read in verse 32. Peter and those with him were in a deep sleep. Deep sleep means they were out. And probably because they'd climbed that mountain. Maybe the altitude was getting to them. I'm sure there are a lot of human reasons why, but they were in a deep sleep. And when they became fully awake, it took them a while, when they became fully awake, they saw his glory. They saw what we've just read. And of course, they saw these two men who were standing with him. And as the two men were departing from him, Peter said to Jesus, Master, it's good for us to be here. Let's set up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah, not knowing what he was saying. Now, it's possible he was still in a stupor, and he was still trying to come out of this deep sleep. But it's also possible that he's just embarrassed and feeling awkward, because at that very time, if you look at the other Gospels, a voice comes from heaven and said, "This is my beloved Son, Peter, listen to him." I like to think, in essence, that God was saying, "Peter, be quiet. This is the moment of my Son, the glorification of my Son." And so consequently, Jesus revealed himself to them. And it's interesting, as I was reading this, and these two things that Luke includes here that the other gospel writers didn't, I immediately thought of the Garden of Gethsemane. You see, there's a literal lesson that comes from this, because in the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter, James, and John were the ones who were with Jesus apart from the rest of the disciples. Same thing, Mount of Transfiguration. But the other thing that happened is what? When Jesus was praying, they fell asleep. You have these two events, and I think that gives us two lessons. One is a literal lesson. We sometimes allow our human weaknesses to take control of our lives when we should be overcomers. Now, I don't want to blame the apostles for falling asleep in both instances. They were very human. But Jesus did say to them, "Could you not stay awake with me in the hour of my agony?" In other words, they weren't really identifying with Christ at this moment in terms of what he was going through. And their humanness took over. I can identify with that. I'm sure most of us can. That it's easy. But there's a spiritual lesson that I think grows out of this, and that is that we must always be alert. That's the spiritual lesson. We need rest. We need sleep. But when it comes to the Christian life, we're to be alert. Not allowing the world system to penetrate our thinking and to cause us to make worldly decisions that are out of the will of God. Paul spoke to this in his letter to the Thessalonians when he said this, "Be alert. For you are all children of light and children of the day." Now he's speaking metaphorically here. He's using illustrations of light and day, and he compares that with night. We do not belong to the night or the darkness. So then let us not sleep. Now, again, this is a spiritual lesson. He's not saying that we don't need sleep. Even Jesus needed sleep in his humanness. When he fell asleep, remember, in the boat that was about ready to capsize. But spiritually, we're not to fall asleep. Like the rest, that is, those who are asleep and unaware of the darkness that surrounds them, the darkness of sin. But let us stay awake, alert, and be self-controlled. And self-control takes discipline, doesn't it? Self-controlled. For those who sleep, sleep at night. Those who get drunk at night. And there is an element of literalness to make a spiritual point. But since we belong to the day, let us be self-controlled and put on the armor of faith and love and a helmet of the hope of salvation. It's amazing when it comes to maturity, particularly for a group of us as believers, we are to reflect faith, a work of faith, a labor of love, steadfastness of hope. In fact, that's how Paul began his first letter to the Thessalonians. I thank God for your work of faith, labor of love, and steadfastness of hope. And here at the end of the letter, he's cautioning them to continue to put on the armor of faith and love and a helmet of the hope of salvation. So let me repeat the principle and then raise the question. In our human weaknesses, even as Christians, we must discipline ourselves to think clearly and to respond biblically. And you know, the Apostle Paul used discipline as an illustration involving physical discipline and spiritual discipline. And if you look at 1 Timothy chapter 4, writing to his fellow missionary, and he says this to Timothy, "For the training of the body has limited benefit." And that's true. I think all of us have experienced that. There is value in physical exercise. In fact, the older you get, your doctor will tell you that exercise can relate directly to your blood pressure and to your blood sugar levels and all of that. We know from physical science, medical science, there is value in physical exercise. But Paul goes on to say, but godliness, this is the discipline now of godliness, spiritual discipline. But godliness is beneficial in every way, since it holds promise for the present life, just like physical exercise does give promise. There's some benefit, significant benefit even, but spiritual exercise, spiritual discipline holds promise for the present life and also for the life to come. It's a powerful illustration that we have here in Paul's letter to Timothy. So here's the question. How can we discipline ourselves to be alert and to think clearly as we live for Christ day by day? And as I looked at that, I thought, well, first of all, Paul does say we need some physical exercise. And I confess I need to do more of that because that takes discipline. But the fact is that what we need more than anything is spiritual discipline, spiritual exercise. How do we discipline ourselves to get that spiritual exercise? Well, I find that one thing that helps me is associations. It's who I associate with. It's how they reflect this quality in their lives. And I admire that. I'm motivated by that. And I've mentioned before in some of these presentations that one of the men that I admired so much, he's now with Jesus, is Dr. Stephen Olford, a man who was born in Africa. His parents were missionaries. He was from England, came to the States, and just became a powerful teacher and preacher. And I had the privilege of associating with him, ministering with him. And he was a godly man. In fact, I found out that in ministering with him that Dr. Billy Graham, when he would have a crusade, he would invite Stephen Olford to come and spend a day with him in prayer. That's how much Billy Graham admired this man's spiritual discipline. You couldn't be with him without realizing that he was a man of God. He wasn't perfect, obviously. But we need those models. I thank God for those models. So we have associations. We have accountability. Accountability, I think, is very, very important. The Bible talks about it. We all need each other. Accountability in our marriages. That can be one of the greatest areas of accountability. It takes two mature people, obviously, to have accountability. In ministry, I look to my board, those that surround me, that I trust, give guidance to me. And we also need planning. We can't just say, I'm going to be disciplined. We need to do something about it. And one of the areas I need to discipline myself every day is in prayer. Because I just don't pray naturally. You know, I can make an excuse. Our very thoughts are prayer for thinking about God's will, but I don't think that's totally what God meant when he said pray without ceasing. I think it means regular prayer, even though it's brief. And I found that keeping a prayer journal is very, very significant for me in terms of spiritual discipline. And then reviewing periodically how God is answering prayer and the other areas where I need to continue to pray about. So we have quite an illustration here, I think, from the Mount of Transfiguration. Let me repeat the principle. In our human weaknesses, even as Christians, we must discipline ourselves to think clearly and to respond biblically.